Alright, so this lecture is going to be on Stanley Fish. Is there a text in this class? And we'll discuss on Stanley Fish's theoretical position with respect to the question of meaning, understanding, and interpretation. Now, Fish begins by pointing to the kind of argument that are often usually made against critiques like Fish, J. Hillis Miller, Derrida, Harold Bloom, by critics like Mayer Abrams, in which the latter points out that how, or argues that how the farmer introduce their own interpretative strategy, means, ideas, judgment, personal subjective elements into their interpretative act, while relying on norms that are essentially communal, norms that are common to all, that are accepted by all, that are shared by all. And this in a way reveals some kind of double game, because they attempt to deconstruct a standard language by using the standard language in itself. So the very presumption that they are understood is an argument against the position that they urge, because according to their position, their being understood is bound to be false. For the basic requirement for understanding is to be the basic requirement for understanding to be formed is mutual agreement, and mutual agreement implies that there is already a common ground known to all, which makes this understanding possible. There is already a common ground, there is already a standard to which one ascribes and aspires. Now, to claim otherwise is to make the project of understanding impossible, is to make understanding impossible. For understanding is possible only when there is implicit mutual agreement, and this mutual agreement is bound to underlie the a standard, a common element, independent of one's own position, one's own individual position, one's own individual strategy, and so on and so forth. Now, this is basically the core argument that is made, that is deployed against critics like Stanley Fish. Now, the first argument, or the first response to this that Fish puts out is this, that he begins by saying that at a prima facie level, even though this accusation may seem plausibility, even if there is some element of plausibility in this accusation, it is so only when this accusation or this argument takes as its object a theory that renders understanding impossible. Where Fish says that this is not a theory, they are not proposing anything or endorsing any theory which renders understanding impossible, but rather Fish states that understanding is possible. So the first claim the counterclaim to the argument put forward by Mayer Abrams that Fish makes is this, that understanding is possible. Now, this claim comes with a qualification. This qualification is important here, as it is the core standpoint or position that Fish urges for himself in matters of meaning, understanding, and interpretation. So, the qualification is that understanding is possible from within a set of interest. Understanding is possible from within a set of interests, right? And all of these acts as elements of constraint. So what Fish says, that in fact every communication is possible on the premise of a commonality of interest. So understanding or communication is possible not so much on the ground of a shared language, but on the ground of a shared interest or concerns, right? And so not on the ground of a shared language, as in terms of one's knowledge of language and the shared know-how to be able to use it. For example, rules of combining and articulating or articulation. So once again, I'm repeating the claim that fish makes is this understanding is possible from within a set of interest, and it is this set of interests that also function as elements of constraint. This is the set of interests that also functions, that also delimits, right, the field or the situation from which understanding in which understanding is possible. So understanding or communication, and this understanding or communication is possible not so much on the basis of a shared language, that two speakers know a particular language well, and therefore whatever is being said, always there is a normative definite way of receiving one's utterance by another. That is not the basis on which understanding is possible. That is not even the basis on which communication is possible. That is, exchange of ideas, reception of idea is possible, but rather on the ground of a shared interest or concerns. This shared interest or concern is the body of interest that Fish talks about. So you will recall that this is not when he's talking about not on the ground of a shared language, one means that not on the ground of shared language in terms of one's knowledge of language or the shared know-how, right. For example, if you recall Saussure, then he says that speech is a combination activity. It's an act of selection and articulation and the psychophysical mechanism that allow the speaker to exteriorize these combinations. So coming back to Fish again, the claim and the qualifications that go with it. So one, understanding is possible but from within a set of interest, within a set of concern, values. Understanding or communication is possible not so much on the ground of a shared language, but because of the shared worldview, value, belief, ways of thinking, and so on and so forth. So it is based on this commonality that one is understood to another. So Fish basically points out that every utterance is understood by someone else because it is already implicated, okay, within a set of assumptions, stipulations, and classification, that lends to the speaker as well as the listener their world of discourse, their common world of discourse, supplying with common identifying labels, right. So I'll just repeat this once again, that Fish basically points out that utterance or every utterance is understood by someone else because it is already implicated in a common set of assumptions, stipulations, classifications, which can be extended to be called as discourse. And there's a common universe of discourse available between the speaker and the listener. So this common universe of discourse, lends to the speaker and the listener their universe of discourse with identifying labels that makes the communication possible. So communication is possible because of this set of assumptions, of which both the listeners and the speakers are already a part of. So we are taking the listener and the speaker, taking them as the minimal pair. So further expansion of this set of assumption, this qualification, this set of assumptions, are not given from outside. So there is no set limit to it. Any communication is possible within a set of assumption or situation, or in other word, within a system, right. So communication and understanding is determined by the confines of that system only. So any understanding that is sought after or beyond or outside the system is impossible. So for Fish, meanings are determinate but within a system. So Fish and other readers are, the argument that is made that they are apostles of indeterminacy and undecidability, and therefore inviting to a world of inviting everyone to a world of pluralism or solipsism is unfounded. So according to Fish, meanings are determinate but within a system. So the fact or the argument that Fish, Derrida, Bloom, or the new readers are apostles of indeterminacy and undecidability, and hence, they invite everyone to a world of pluralism and solipsism is unfounded. Right. And as way of illustration, therefore, that the claim is unfounded. As way of illustration, Fish picks up one example of an utterance, a question by a student to a professor at Johns Hopkins University. Is there a text in the class? Right now, the exact nature of the charge, before we move into this, the exact nature of the charge that is made against Fish and other critiques will be found if you refer to page 305, second paragraph. I am just reading it. So these are the core elements of the accusations or of the arguments brought against the new readers. So one is that the most persistent is that these apostles of indeterminacy. So this is page 305 of the essay. If you're having the essay with you while you are listening to the lecture, you can refer to the second paragraph of this essay. In this is that these apostles of indeterminacy and undecidability ignore, even as they rely upon the norms and possibilities embedded in language, the linguistic meaning words undeniably have, and thereby invite us to abandon our ordinary realm of experience in speaking, hearing, reading, understanding for a world in which no text can mean anything in particular, and where we can never say just what anyone means by anything that he writes. So charge is that literal or normative meanings are overridden. So that one of the core elements of this charge is that any normative meaning or linguistic meaning gets overridden by an act of willful interpretation, to such an extent that to retain a world of meaning as permeating our everyday realm of speaking, hearing, and other activities becomes impossible, and what we are left with instead is a world of indeterminacy where nothing can mean anything. So this requires Fish to begin his defense with the question of normative meaning, which is said to be embedded in language, and with respect to this, he takes the example of the utterance that Fish takes up. Is there a text in the class? Now, at the outset, two things emerge. One, in Fish's argument that there is a literal meaning. So two things that Fish points out is that if one takes the example of a particular utterance, in this instance, is there a text in this class for example, then two things emerge. One, that there is a literal meaning of this utterance, and if so, then what is it? Because if there is one literal meaning, we should be able to say it. And two, there is not one but many meanings, and not one of those is a literal one. So Fish says that his story is suggestive of having at least two literary meanings to the utterance. One is, and he says that there is therefore no case of undecidability here, as it is often as it is claimed, as it is charged. There is no case of undecidability here. Rather, there are very determined cases of decidability, right? Cases of decidability, And these cases of decidability, they do not have the same shape and can in fact alter. So the colleague's answer is a function of public and constituting norms of language and understanding. In the first case, the norm was supplied by requirement of textbook in a particular course, and the second response to the question, is there a text in the class, in the second instance, the norm, on being allotted by the teacher, by the student, the in the second instance the norm is supplied by by the range of theoretical position that may be available to an instructor. So in both the cases, in both the responses to the utterance, in both the case, the colleague's response is not an individual idiosyncratic innovation, but rather it is a function of public and constituting norms of language and understanding. And in neither of the case is meaning imposed or interpretation a private innovating act. Rather, interpretation in both the cases has been a function of norms. So it is not that Fish is denying norms of any kind, but rather stating that norms are there, these norms are embedded in in an institution, in a structure within which the utterance is heard, and that the utterance is already the utterance is heard within a situation which is already a result of organization within a structure. So interpretation or interpretative act is not free, neither it is endlessly plural, but rather controlled, organized, determined not by rules of language system, but by assumption and practices of the institution or the situation in which the utterance is already embedded. Fish writes that meaning inheres within an institutional structure. So anybody knowing English, for instance, or who can communicate in English, will not be able to access any of the two interpretations of the utterance made by the colleague unless the native speaker is party to either the two set of norms that supplied the interpretation in the first place, either what was under the general rubric of the first day of class, or issues in contemporary literary theory. So this is not to say that the utterance is completely unavailable to someone outside the scope of these two conditions. The utterance that is the question, is there a text in the class, here is available, in fact always available, always will be available in some way or other. In fact, unintelligibility in a pure sense is never possible, argues Fish. So again, to recapitulate some of the positions stated by Fish with respect to the problem of meaning, understanding and interpretation, let's recall. Number one, understanding or communication always takes place within a set of interest, concern, knowledge. Number two, understanding depends on the shared ground of values and not just something called shared language. Number three, it is not that the above claims points to a never-ending plurality or undecidability, but that it speaks of decidability shaped by principle of constraints, or that which is supplied by constraints. Constraints are provided by the situation itself in which the utterance is already embedded even before it comes to be received as an utterance. Number five, decidability and understanding is contingent upon the situation. It is the situation that determines access to an utterance, or in other words, access to the possible meaning of the utterance. So in other words, meaning is a case of infinite possibility. as there may be infinite situations. True, but at the same time, meaning is also regulated by the situation sorry, in which it lends to appear. In which it tends to appear. Number 6, nothing is purely unintelligible, since nothing is uttered or can be uttered without or outside a situation. So we are never, in a state of a situation so as to have a meaning which will stand, together across all situations or independent of any situation. Right. So we'll come back to this point later, as this is important in terms of the question of values and morals with respect to one's theory. But in the meantime, you can, before we proceed, you can, if you have the text with you, look at page 312, second paragraph of the text, where a fish says, I mean, if you can have recourse to the last 2 points that we just made. Right. So moving on from the above points that we just recapitulated, one principle that emerges in Fish's thought that emerges out is the limit, principle of limit or constraint placed by a situation on the utterance. Had the limit imposed by the situation would not be present, indeed, it might have been the case that we would face ourselves with the prospect of what is termed as an infinite plurality of meanings. Excuse me. However, it is because there is a limit placed by the situation that meaning of the utterance is being severely constrained, not after it was heard, but in the ways it could be heard. So, it is this limit placed by the situation that, in a way, orders or organizes ways in which an utterance could have been or could be heard. So that an infinite plurality of meanings, therefore, becomes a baseless fear. It never is the case that a sentence does not emerge in situation. Rather, sentences always emerge in situation, and within those normative meaning of an utterance, within those situations, normative meaning of an utterance will always be obvious or at least accessible. Even discriminating between the meanings can be possible by a virtue of one's being in different situations. So, in other words, an immutable, fixed, standard, once and for all ranking of the meaning is not possible, as as they are never independent of situations. It is only in situation that the meanings appear or don't appear. So, Fish is making a powerful observation here, the observation of institutional nesting, which holds significant implication for the way we approach or form our perception of literature, interpretation, and so on and so forth. That literature and interpretation is not a value neutral, neither is it a power neutral enterprise. So Fish says that on the question of which meaning is more normal, or in other words, which meaning is more immediately accessible, immediately available, he says this, that it, at the risk of even reinstating reintroducing the category of normal, will ultimately depend on the degree of availability of a situation, context, or perception or worldview over another. In fact, at times, therefore, the degree of availability of a particular institution or situation is so high and so prevalent that for a great many people, meanings seem a product of nature and therefore natural than a product of circumstance. So it is the situation that ultimately holds the organizing power, that organizes an utterance, our utterance as well as our perception. So again, if you move to the second paragraph, for example, of page 308, and you can refer to the second paragraph of page 308, where he is talking about this institutional nesting. Also, see in the example of another utterance, the air is crisp. You know, Fish notes that precisely by not surrounding the utterance by any specific context, the utterance will be automatically heard or linked to the context in which it is most likely to be produced or has most often been encountered. Here too, the utterance meaning is constrained by a situation and not by the meanings words have in a normative linguistic system. And yet, one cannot confer on an utterance any meaning one likes, right? So this you will recall similar to the relation between signifier and signified by Saussure. Signification is a function of the system. Signification is determined by the system and not outside it. One cannot alter the terms of signification at one's own will. So Fish's colleague reading or understanding of the question in the first instance was not a mistake in combining the student's words and syntax into a meaningful unit, but rather in the assumption of what its concerns could possibly be, or what Fish calls as the case of mistaken identification of the student's intention. So the colleague misread the structure of interest from which the utterance might have emerged, and it is this mispredetermination or a mismatch in the predetermination of the set of interest between the student and the teacher that a communication failure took place and the student had to intervene. To correct himself, the colleague will necessarily make another set of predetermination. Now, how does he do this eventually? How does the student's intervention or words, or if at all, lead him to the next set of predetermination? Now, this is a question that one can dispose of according to Fish, because implicit in it is a suggestion of precedence, when precedence is actually beside the point, as two actions that is being spoken about here, one hearing her words and thinking within a set of circumstance, that he ultimately thinks in, or in other words, identification of the context and making sense of it. Both these actions occur simultaneously. So to the colleague, the second hearing of the utterance was possible because of the availability of context with its own categories of organization. For example, one category is one of Fish's victims within single inverted comma. Categories that are still, function of that still continue to be function of the former situation, former set of norms, but slightly altered, moderated, which is, let's say following Fish, the university or academic business. So one shared basis of agreement in the whole affair had been the text and ways of thinking about the text. So in case the device that is within quote one of Fish's victim was not available for intelligibility, the student could have supplanted her interlocutor's structure of concerns by bringing on, by hinging upon the ways of thinking about a text that is prevalent or needs challenging, etc. So what is important here is the change in modification. You can see this, page 316, if you have the text with you, the last paragraph, you can refer refer to that portion of the text here. So, before wrapping up, I would like to recall your attention to the sixth point that we had made, remember, and the implication it bears upon the question of the system of values on part of fish. So, to Abrams and other critics of Fish's proposition or theoretical position that communication occurs within situation, and to be in a situation means to be in possession of a structure of assumption, purpose, goals, and it is from within the confines of the situation that an utterance is immediately heard because there isn't any space or a distance, or a moment before interpretation, as meanings come already embedded within a situation of norms. And this structure of norms isn't abstract and independent, but social, and it is also constitutive of the public. Because the structure also changes if the situation so demands or directs. Now, this proposition by Fish to Abrams and others, this may seem to endorse a relativist position, and the danger underlying such a position would be one to entertain an infinite plurality of norms, standards, and values, leading us with no capacity for judging between the competing system of values, with the result inevitably being having a position of no values at all. So it is like having a position where you can endorse many values is similar or is akin to a position having no values at all. So this, however, Fish states that for a particular individual, this is besides the point, as no one is without a situation. And as no one is without a situation, not having an as situational norm will hardly be of any practical significance. If you look at page 319, the second paragraph, where he says, and I can just read it here, but it is beside the point for any particular individual, since everyone is situated somewhere, there is no one for whom the absence of an situational norm would be of any practical consequence, in the sense that his performance or confidence in his ability to perform would be impaired. So that while it is generally true that to have many standard is to have none at all, so this is general, right? It is not true for anyone in particular, but there is no one in a position to speak generally, and therefore it is a truth of which one can say it doesn't matter. So this brings us to Fish's remarkable insight on the question of relativism of thought, and he says that relativism may be a position that one can entertain, but it is impossible to occupy. It is impossible to occupy a position of relativism, since everyone, each one of us, is implicated in the structure or situation, in some structure or situation or another. So, and our consciousness, each one of us, is enabled by norms and values that we hold. In fact, none of us live in an innocent, asituational, acontextual consciousness. Right. So, finally, again, to recall Saussure, I'm not going into the details, but you would remember that language is individual and social both at the same time. So, you will see Stanley Fish making the proposition that solipsism and relativism are not possible modes of being. You cannot live in a solipsist or relativist position anyway, because the set of assumptions in which we are implicated are, again, we are already implicated in a set of assumptions. And also the point that is made here is that you cannot, this cannot be a solipsist position. Why? Because the set of assumptions in which we find ourselves already implicated are not sourced in us. They are not our private property, but rather they are sourced in communal and conventional. So meaning in question is ultimately a community property, and so are we. Okay, right? So we'll keep till this, and with this I think Stanley Fish, is there a text in this class, is somewhat covered, and I would now expect that all of you listening to the lecture will refer to the text once again in a more detailed manner. Right, thank you.